Hi, everyone. I hope you got your coffee or your tea. Oh, David's got a new cup. Well, here we are, entering into episode 12 of What is Truth with the venerable Reverend David William Parry. And during these conversations, we've done an exploration of sorts, a cultural exploration within the context of a conversation. In the tone of the fairy tale The Lily and the Green Snake and the Beautiful Lily by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, where the king says, "From whence come you?" The snake says, "From the caverns where the gold was." The king says, "What is grander than gold? Light. What is more refreshing than light? Conversation." And so few things are more British than Edward Elgar, here masterfully being performed by the Warsaw Symphony Orchestra and Nimrod on his variations. David, how are you, buddy?
John, always a pleasure. Oh my God, was that an apocalyptic way of saying this is our last show? I do hope not. I do hope not. I'm sporting my dear stalker for you. I've got my magnifying glass so we can discern the truth together. I've shamelessly given a piece of product placement there, Cafe Nero, for no other reason than the fact I needed a tea, and that was on the way back from the fact. Yeah, I'm sort of. How am I in Boris's third world country? Johnson's version to North Korea? I don't know, actually. On a personal level, I'm sort of happy. I and my partner had a mini break yesterday. Um, I'm sort of overwhelmed with things to do because, of course, we've got TEDx Lambeth coming up in less than 2 weeks now. So that's it's draining everybody involved with the project. How our wonderful impresario is dealing with it all, I don't know. But we're all hands to the pump, as it were. And of course, we're reopening Valentine's Hall, which is an emerging metropolitan community church group, at what they call the Balham. What is it? Balham Community Church. A number of churches share those premises, and we're sort of finalising contracts. So it's good. I mean, a couple of minor health issues. Apparently, I've got rheumatoid arthritis, which is great fun. Great fun. Apart from that, all is well. I'm not ready to hear Algar's death march yet. So, but yeah, all is well. How yourself, my friend? And how are you?
Oh, I'm great. So, as always, I tend to try and put thought into what we might converse regarding. And of course, we tend to return to themes that are British, being that you are in the City of London. Well, actually, not in the City of London proper. You don't live in the square mile, that oasis of mercantilism that seems to be behind so much of what's going on today, irrespective of the will of the British people. And that's kind of a problematic situation. It reminds me of a conversation that I was attempting to have with a member of Eric Clapton's band some time ago who now lives in Britain. And I'm not going to call her out by name, it would be improper to point out a lady, but she was so strongly tied up with this postmodern narrative. And it's really confusing to me that somebody can't see past the veneer when great overarching systems always have to do with power and control. And that's kind of why I led in with the Nimrod variation by Edward Elgar. I think that that's probably perfectly applicable, seeing as how the Nimrodian impulse came into the city of Venice, and from Venice came into the city of London. Excuse me. They're making me choke up on this one. So when we get into the understanding current events, of course, as most people that have followed this show, and those of you that don't know because you're new, but my basic approach to history is fundamentally coming through the works of Rudolf Steiner, the leading initiate to speak openly in the 20th century. And he was able to really, in the early parts of the 20th century, give people kind of a panoramic view of the ground swell of globalism that was coming out of the crumbling remains of the British Empire, and where they transformed the British Empire into a basically commercial venture. And so consequently, what we're looking at today is kind of the end game of that. And it's puzzling to many people. But I've spent, as I've said before, 40, 45 years researching the subject. And in Rudolf Steiner's work, one of the most important sources is a cycle of lectures called The Karma of Materialism, where he tries to develop the ideas surrounding the reductionist scientism that came out during the middle of the 19th century. And there's the utilitarian impulse that was championed so much. And it's just trying to reduce things down to the simple concepts of materialism, which totally evades the spiritual impulses that are coming forward at this time since 1879, as I spoke before, of the war in heaven, so to speak, that Rudolf Steiner refers to, where the Michaelic forces drove the Ahrimanic forces of materialism to earth. Unfortunately for us, though, they seek to inhabit the minds and souls of those individuals on earth. Of course, these spirits themselves know better than to think that materialism is true, but nonetheless, they inspire individuals to come to the conclusion that there's some kind of reductionist, materialistic way of dealing with things. But Rudolf Steiner himself, in the lecture cycle, Eternal and Transient Elements, Cosmic Past of Humanity, and the Mystery of Evil, makes it very clear that to pursue that kind of approach as a cultural theme can only end in conflict. That the really the great healing impulse that is to be found is to be through expanding our awareness of the processes that go beyond the material and into the etheric, astral, and on into the spiritual world, with the inspiration of all the spiritual beings that stand behind those impulses. And so that's part of what we're trying to address here as a form of kind of reclaiming the world from the forces of materialism that's so pronounced at this time. And so that's why I brought in a wonderful soul like Reverend David, who's responsible for producing some celebrated works book of poetry, Caliban's Redemption, available on eBay. His Grammar of Witchcraft, which, as I often say, is not about witchcraft, it's a Shakespearean study, and his principal work, Mount Athos Inside Me, Essays on Religion, Swedenborg and the Arts. And these can all be found on eBay. As for myself, I was the manager of the Mayflower Bookshop for many years, and we're the largest metaphysical, alternative, and holistic bookstore in the world, at least according to Donald Weiser, who everybody told him he was the biggest, and he told us we were twice as large as he was. And that was before we expanded and doubled our size. But so I've been in contact with most of the spiritual streams, cultural streams, holistic health, and all of that. But the main sail of my ship is, of course, like I said, Rudolf Steiner. My first book is The Arcana, the Grail Angel, The Spiritual Science of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail, which is a study developed out of the work of Rudolf Steiner of the underground streams of esoteric Christianity, which flowed from the Brotherhood of the Holy Grail, the Order of the Knights Templar, and the True Rosicrucian Order. And the sequel to that is a meditative tool, The Arcana of Light on the Path. These are both available on eBay for those that want a deeper venture into the subject. And included in the books are many diagrams that give you the 12-fold and 7-fold cosmology that is the backdrop for Grail Christianity. Coming out of all that work at the Mayflower, I ended up creating a relational database for one of our wealthy clients. And it was a computerized database of the sources of esotericism, primarily of a Western character. That was 6,000 volumes. And after that, I created in excess of 15,000 volume computerized database with cross-referencing of Egyptian and Mesopotamian studies. So I'm quite widely read in many subjects, and what I try to do is synthesize these things. And through my encounter with the fascinating Leo Lion Zagami from Italy, hello Leo, I was able to meet Reverend David William Parry, who's apparently has just received a wonderful announcement that he's now tied into the Royal Society. Could you give us a little explanation of what that might mean?
Oh, that lead-in ruined my first gag, so I'll have to do it the other way around. Yes. After 8 years of work, it's a very long story. Let me take a step back. I've always had a passion for Central Asia. I mean, Central Asia is history, and it seems to be, in many ways, the unknown region nowadays in geographical, political, and cultural studies, which is amazing because it is history. You know, everything's either been through there or come from there. So my passion for Central Asian literature. Oh gosh, where do I start with that? I mean, it originated, I suppose, indirectly. I didn't go out for nearly 2 years when I was a teenager. I discovered Russian novels. Russian novels give you the world. They're extraordinary. So I hardly went out for 2 years, and the best 2 years I had as a teenager. And I don't know what that means, but there we are. And you know, there were inklings. People would mention authors like Chingiz Aitmatov, but they wouldn't really say who it was or what it meant. And in those days, in this part of the world, there were precious few references, let alone books, let alone poetry, which is the sort of lifeblood of Central Asia. You know, so you'd come across snippets here and there about what it all was and what they were all saying. Eventually, materials began to sort of filter through. I mean, the great Nobel Prize-winning Chingiz Aitmatov was a giant of Kyrgyzstan modernist literature. I mean, he's in many ways the father of the novel over there. So I started reading him, and a friend of mine, curiously, Mukhtar Shakhanov, won the Nobel Prize for Poetry in 1990. So I've had an in-depth love and a passion for that part of the world. And after 8 years of swearing at people in Russian, contributing, and believe me, they know how to swear back. Okay, so it's a two-way process. Don't worry. If anybody thinks evil Whitey rules the world, they need to go and have a couple of vodkas anywhere in Central Asia, and they know that's not true for a start. I mean, these people know how to look after themselves. So yeah, after 8 years of contributing essays, articles, reviews, oversights, dare I say, personal articles, oversights, and editing a number of extraordinary books. Dare I blow my own trumpet for a minute? I think it's about 40 pieces of work altogether. The Royal Asiatic Society basically proposed to me, Reverend, don't you think we ought to make an honest man of you? And so I agreed. And at a meeting of theirs, someone proposed me, somebody very kindly proposed me, somebody seconded me, and I've all of a sudden found myself a fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society, which I'm deeply proud of. And I don't know if, will I still be struggling to pay the gas and electric bill? I suspect I will. But, it's sort of, for me, it's the accolade of a lot of work over an 8-year period. I mean, the Grammar of Witchcraft, which you very kindly held up a minute ago, hardly anybody will know this, was influenced by Chingiz Aitmatov. And I nearly met him when I moved to London in the early 80s. And some Ruskies I knew said, look, you've got to come to this drinks do. Everything in London happens through a drinks do. You've got to come to this drinks do and you'll meet a writer. And I said, well, who is he? And they said, look, you've heard about him, Chingiz Aitmatov. And I, well, that sounds interesting. So I went to the drinks do. And, it's one of those weird things in London. You get a small room with about 1,000 people in it. So, you see somebody the other side of the room. And I remember waving at him. And I remember him waving back, at least I think it was him. But I couldn't get to see him for various reasons. And there was only one other chance that the same group of very, very sneaky Russians said to me a couple of weeks later, well, you didn't get to chat with him then. And I said, no. Well, he's holding another do. But that was much more official, so I didn't get the chance to actually speak to him. So did I or didn't I meet Chingiz Aitmatov? I don't know to this day. But yeah, it was a long haul, John. It was a long haul, and as I say, my passion for Central Asian literature, the poetry, the artistry, the paintings, the carpets, the way Russians said, the way they use jewels, I have been to the very city where Aladdin used to be a street urchin. I mean, that's not something everyone can say. I have been to the mountains next to Mukhtar Shakhanov's office. He was what was he? A diplomat for Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is my other home. And he's grimly said to me, the other side of those mountains is China, with that sort of look on his face. And I didn't know what to say. So, oh my God, if we got those mountains, we're looking at China. And I'll tell you a story. A friend of mine from Kyrgyzstan, Sultan Rayev, invited me to dinner the last time I was in that neck of the woods, and said to me, because they're Muslims, but they're gentle Shia Muslims who have a very inclusive, very, very human and humanistic view. So, I'm used to saying prayers at the end of supper. And I think I've said on this show before, but the minute they know you're a pastor, they try and drag you into it to lead prayers. So, you're constantly ducking and diving to make sure nobody knows too far. Otherwise, you get 2 jobs at the price of 1. But we had this fascinating conversation about the Chinese. I met the Chinese cultural attaché at the University of Osh, a spectacular Chinese city, glittering at the very top of the world. Literally the geographical top of the world. they started building robotic trains. They want to revive the Silk Road, and none of the Central Asians would talk to him because they were angry. They were angry with the Chinese. They've been angry with the Chinese for 1,000 years, and they're still angry. And the Chinese cultural attaché was relieved he had someone to talk to, and said they were very happy because these trains now build each other. They don't have any human being involved in the process. And I said, well, that's creepy. To which he replied, well, it might be creepy, but it will help trade. And I thought, well, what do you say to that? The other thing was that evening I was invited, as I say, to Sultan Rayev's table as a dinner guest. And he said, look, why are we angry with the Chinese? They're all Muslims in that part of the world. Therefore, they're the children of Abraham. And I thought, well, that's fair enough. That's fair enough. So if you said to say a Central Asian soldier that somebody needed shooting in the back of the head, would they do it? Yes, but they would know it was wrong. Whereas if you said that to a Chinese soldier, he'd shoot you in the back of the head and he wouldn't know it was wrong. And I thought, oh my God, there's a story. I do hope that's not true. I hope that's the Central Asians just scoring points. But yeah, so I've had this tiny sort of elevation. Actually, it might not be a tiny one. This elevation during the week, and I'm feeling very happy. And thank you to everyone at the Royal Asiatic Society. I hope to be making a contribution soon to this wonderful British Orientalist tradition, which I strangely find myself a part of. And I've got to hand back to you with a gag. I saw this wonderful meme during the week where, as as I say, all of our traditions of liberty and liberalism are collapsing around us in Britain at the minute, under a number of pretexts, and everybody's getting poor. I mean, Boris Johnson is trashing the economy. And so that's been on everybody's lips this week. And I saw this wonderful meme with the Queen, Her Majesty herself, in one of those awful headscarves. You think a woman with that amount of money would be advised on what she should wear. Love, you've got to stop wearing headscarves. It doesn't suit you. I'm sorry. It makes your face look square. Stop it, please. Anyway, the meme saying economics hits everybody. The Queen is down to her last 500 billion. What will she do? So on that note, I'll hand it back to you, John. I wish I was down to my last 500 billion. I'll hand the comeback to you.
Well, that being said, visible. There's a big difference between visible assets and what you might call as invisible assets. And so if you do an assessment of what's going on in the world today, I have it around here somewhere. I always have so many books around me, it's hard for me to find them. Well, here it is. Giants, the Global Power Elite by Peter Phillips. And let's see, Noam Chomsky, who's not one of my favorite people, but he is pretty smart, says, who exactly are the masters? This remarkable inquiry lifts the veil, providing detailed and often shocking revelations. And so when you get into understanding that the number of people who own almost everything is a very, very short list, it's radically disturbing. And the financial network of the world runs through the city of London. I don't care what anybody says. New York has an important role, yeah. So does Rome, but so does Washington. But the actual hub of international finances through the square mile, which is the City of London, Inc. And that's an interesting city-state. If you look at the history of Londinium, which is what it was called when it was a Roman trade center, they were given very specific rights by the Romans. in an effort to stimulate trade with all the various regions within Britain at that time. And back in 1066, when William the Conqueror came in with a bunch of people, including my family, they were able to conquer a great deal of Britain, but they weren't capable of conquering the city of London because it was so well protected. And the Anglo-Saxons that were presiding there at the time ultimately cut a deal with William the Conqueror that gave them advantage because William the Conqueror said, okay, look, this is what I'm going to do. And he cut a deal. He said they could continue with the agreement that they had with the ancient Romans. And so they continue to this day to have special privileges that were bestowed upon them from the Roman Empire and continued with William the Conqueror. People don't know that. But if you look at your large financial firms, banks and all of that, they really tend to have offices and corporate entities that are centered within the city of London, the square mile, so that they have certain privileges. As to the Queen herself, she has an interesting perspective on many of these things, and people don't realize how important she is to this whole equation. But over at American Intelligence Media and Americans for Innovation, our sister organization, we've been researching it for quite a few years now and filling in the blanks that are directly related to that lecture cycle that I mentioned by Dr. Rudolf Steiner, The Karma of Materialism, and also other lecture cycles that he gave, the cult movement of the 19th century, and the other lecture cycle that I mentioned, Eternal and Transient Elements. So that if you start looking closely, you'll see that there's a financial empire that exists, and that there's the central banking system that's all centered around the Bank of England, and that the actual Federal Reserve Bank of the United States is basically a satellite of the Bank of England, and that the control of economics within the United States even is determined by an organization that's directly tied into the Bank of England, chartered under the Bank of England. And then you start looking deeper and you realize that many of these corporations, the transnational corporations that operate out of the city of London, to be able to take advantage of that privilege, assign a golden share to the Queen. And what that does, and it usually costs her just, maybe a few pounds to get that golden share, but she has powers of veto and certain plenipotentiary powers over whatever corporation it might be, so that she's an extremely significant individual. Whether or not and to what extent she's conscious of certain things that take place, it's hard to say, because the spider's web of corporations, offshore entities, financial institutions, foundations, all the various offshore entities running through the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and all these banking considerations tend to be run by her Privy Council, which is around 500 or so individuals. But at the center of this, you'll find Sir Geoffrey Patty and Lord Mark Malloch Brown. And they're basically, you could see them as a continuation of the East India Company, of which your ancestors played a prominent role. And so, we could dig into some of those things. We've dug into them before, but it's important to understand at this time that central to that was a certain endeavor that was put into play by Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes who was famous for the country that was once known as Rhodesia, which involves certain parts of South Africa and other places in Africa, and he was able to develop diamond and gold mines to take advantage of the stance of British imperialism. But what people don't understand is that frequently these types of machinations are laid at the doorstep of a family from Frankfurt, the Rothschild family. And it's created all manner of difficulties for people that are adherents of Judaism. When actually, if you look at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, the two central figures in the machinations of the Rothschild dynasties were Lord Rosebery, who wasn't Jewish, but his wife was, and there's Henry de Worms. And Henry de Worms, he converted to Anglican, and he left behind a lot of his Jewish associates. So it becomes a moot point as far as to the spearhead of globalism, as to what extent it involves Judaism, when actually the origins of the Rothschild family are tied into certain impulses that are known as Sabbatean, stemming from Sabtai Tzvi, and at that time with the Polish, he has to be considered a former Jew, Jakob Frank, because there's been really for the last 400 years, the Sabbateans were excommunicated from Judaism. But the Sabbateans are functionaries beneath the surface of Judaism, Christianity through Catholicism, and also as into Islam. Actually, Sabbatean impulse came out of Salonika in Turkey. So there's many different levels of this that we can look at. But for our modern era, what we have to look at first is the Parliament of the Press, the first Imperial Press Conference, has a preface by the Earl of Rosebery, who I just mentioned, who was married to Hannah de Rothschild, and he inherited the lion's share of the British aspect of the Rothschild fortunes. There were 5 Rothschild families, but through the first Imperial Press Conference was developed modern intelligence as we know it, and the 5 eyes that's so often spoken of was born at that time. And so you have HCHQ, and then you have all the various intelligence organizations that came out of Britain and the United States. Basically, the OSS was born through British efforts, through Sir William Stevenson in Canada, who owned the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Company, and various industrial interests, and he was the one who personally financed and established a training camp on the north shore of Lake Erie. And Wild Bill Donovan and all of that were involved in developing the OSS, and it became the CIA, which went through a radical transformation leading up to JFK declaring to smash the CIA into a million pieces, and we all know what happened to him. And they are playing a very much central role. As far as Henry de Worms, that's Lord Pirbright. Well, let's just say that the Pirbright Institute holds the patent on the coronavirus. So here we are today.
Gosh, where do I begin with all that? Is this will horrify you? I used to know Chomsky. I haven't spoken in years. Doesn't he look old recently? but I used to know Chomsky. I was trying to drag him to Azerbaijan to open a museum, and he told me, "I'm sorry, I'd love to do it. It sounds absolutely fascinating, but my diary is booked for 5 years ahead." And I thought, well, in that case, that might be true. So, yeah, the sort of slight thing with Chomsky there. Oh gosh, conspiracies. I never know what I think of conspiracies. At the moment, I'm very open-minded to them, bearing in mind what's happening across the UK. The one thing that did catch my attention over the last day or so, and it was pointed out to me by someone who's got a singular amount of training in the intelligence field, was both the head of MI6 and the head of MI5 have suddenly changed roughly at the same time. And that's not really what happens here. So you've got one view now going through the entire intelligence networks of the UK. I don't know how that impacts anyone else, but I find that incredibly threatening. That one administration can appoint people that it knows will agree with them and do what is necessary to enforce that view. I find that absolutely frightening. So internal security services, and they're all for our protection. They tell us that all the time. And external community intelligence services, which of course are designed to manipulate people who aren't from these shores. I don't know who is and who isn't. I mean, in a country like Britain, I don't know how anyone can, you can't play the pure game in Britain because everybody's a mixture of everything. It's the one country you can't do that in. It would be ridiculous. But yeah, I find heaven alone knows what's happening to the UK at the minute. It's increasingly sinister. It's an oppressive atmosphere. And, I think the big players are still behind the scenes. To my mind, Boris Johnson isn't really the power player he says he is, because he always seems to be waiting in response to something. I'm not the only person to get that impression. Other people have thought that too. There's a very good friend of mine, Patrick Kavanagh, who's an excellent poet, by the way, and he was a journalist. He used to have a press pass to number 10, which was revoked a couple of years ago because whatever happened to investigative journalism, he was asking the awkward questions, so they told him to sod off. And now you get everybody at number 10 press briefings who loves everything the government does in this mock gladiatorial battle where, oh, Boris, what are you doing now? Oh, we disapprove. So either it's them saying what they want, indirectly, and then Boris issuing their opinion by diktat because democracy seems to have gone out the window. And, for an old libertarian like me, that's absolutely horrific, let alone frightening in the distant future. Maybe not too distant future. But certainly, or it's basically him and these endless, research groups that seem to say exactly what they want, and then he delivers it without the slightest thought. But lots of people are saying that there's another force, there's another element, there's another level of authority at work in what he says and what he does, and you never know. So at the moment, I'm open to conspiracy theories because this country tends to be. I don't know if you ever saw the movie, John. It seems to be turning into V for Vendetta every single day at the moment. The trouble is we don't have a noble cavalier to help us out. My favourite bit of that movie, I mean, we're coming up to bonfire night in Britain. Remember the 5th of November, where, of course, we burned Guy Fawkes on a fire because the fool didn't even manage to blow up Parliament. You give someone a barrel of gunpowder and they still can't pull it off. For God's sake, man. So we burn him every year on our national bonfires, which are, an autumn, the end of autumn ceremony, and have toffee apples and lovely things like that, and go to firework displays. And of course, the hero, the cavalier in V for Vendetta, is reciting "Remember the 5th of November" all the way through. And he blew up at the beginning of the movie. I think it's the beginning of the movie. I haven't seen it for years. The figure of justice on top of the High Courts of Justice saying, "Who is that imposter?" My God, can the Cavalier come back and help us all out, please? You know, we need him. We need him at this particular time. The Privy Council, I mean, God's sake. I don't think most people have got past the open fraud and fantasy of the Commonwealth, which means basically lots of different countries giving the Queen a lot of money, because it doesn't seem to mean anything else apart from that. You know, so when you get to sort of much more esoteric, in the wrong sense of the word, organisations like the Privy Council and the endless backstabbing which seems to go on there, I just despair. I've had some dealings with both chambers of the House. To be honest, the vast majority aren't the sort of people I'd invite to dinner or spend time with on a social footing, because they only think about one thing, which is money, which is either associated with power or leading to power. You know, maybe we get the sort of people we deserve in government. What a terrible thought. The CIA, I try and always avoid commenting on foreign politics. Remember, I'm only a Brit, and foreign services such as the CIA, because I never really know in any depth. I'm not. I'd love to be a Yankee Doodle dandy, but unfortunately, at the moment, I'm not. I'm stuck with the British passport. But who knows what the angels hold ahead of me? Who knows? But you know, they do seem this side of the pond to be sinister. But from my, you know, or at least then engage in sinister activities, maybe for the best reasons. But the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I think we all need to remember that. But not nearly as sinister as MI5, that, you know, is now pretending all sorts of scenarios are going to be worked through. I don't want to go too far into that until I'm more certain on my ground. Maybe that's next week's show. But, you know, the police are buying practically armoured weaponry, which is military. You know, so what are they planning and what are they expecting down the line a bit? And you know, and MI5 is now openly spying on us all for our own good. This is V for Vendetta. My trouble with social critics at the moment is they're still comparing the future, but the future's now, it's arrived. They're still comparing the future to 1984, but that's not where we are. We're now in a program. Do you remember The Prisoner, John? Patrick McGowan, with that incredible opening. That's where we are now. You know, a spy, and you never know why he resigns. A spy resigns, and before he's even got back to his own flat to pack his bag, they've got him. They gas him and take him to a mysterious island where he's just tricked and doped and gassed all the way through. That's where we are now. We're being manipulated and tricked day in and day out, and that's a lot more sinister than an all-powerful party which one day will be toppled. Because in the island of the prisoner, the town of the prisoner, you never know where you stand. That's the UK now. I'm handing back to you. I'm sure they're just about to beat down my door after that, but there we are. I'm handing back to you.
They're coming to take you away to the funny farm where life is beautiful all the time. Yeah, unfortunately, there's the saying, you know, that keeps getting repeated ad nauseum: power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Great men are almost always bad men. And the Lord that said that certainly knew what power was about. And if you go back to the period that I keep pointing out at the turn into the 20th century, it can give you definite clues. I mean, the very fact that Lord Rosebery himself wrote a biography of Lord Chatham. Today we have Chatham House, and I think that that's very key in understanding this drama we're going through. I'm reminded of the deliberation in a meeting in Parliament that was published by them, and they're asking, and of course, this Chatham House rules, which says, according to Chatham House rules, you can't say who said anything, so that they don't have to deal with the consequences of whatever they say. But the response from Chatham House to the election of Donald Trump to the presidency of the United States was that they should designate more funds for scholarships to American students. So let's just say they have a long-term plan in mind, and if you look into that and you get into the study of the Cecil Rhodes organization, which became Alfred Milner, the Viscount Alfred Milner's kindergarten, that became the Commonwealth, and it was based on the last will and testament of Cecil Rhodes that was published, edited by W.T. Stead, who was the leading journalist in Britain at that time and was the individual that introduced Annie Besant to Madame Helena Blavatsky, the founder of the Theosophical Society, and Annie Besant ended up becoming the head of the Theosophical Society, and which now, in hindsight, we could see that this is a clear incursion by these unusual forces that seem to keep cropping up every time something is done to try and bring a boost to human culture. There's an assertion of power, and so consequently, Annie Besant and Charles Webster Leadbeater, the Anglican, proclaimed Jiddu Krishnamurti to be the second coming of Christ, which caused Rudolf Steiner to leave the Theosophical Society, which is a telling event, shall we say. And Krishnamurti, to his credit, who is a brilliant man, has done so many books have been put out by this individual who passed the rest of his life in California. And of course, he stepped aside and said, no, that's not me. And so he disavowed his role as the Maitreya Buddha / second coming. And so that's good for him. And he is a remarkable individual nonetheless, but it was a machination for centralization that is continually asserting itself, and is even found to this day that you find that the Lucis Trust is very prominent in the UN, and Alice Bailey's channeled writings, and so there's all this kind of stuff that's become prominent. And I have very dear friends from my past that are very much involved in a lot of these things and have faith in it. My friends from Findhorn, David Spangler, and of course I knew Caddy, and I knew Dorothy McLean, and all these people we used to bring in, and Malenko Matanovic and his wife Kathy Lightstone, the New Troubadours, and we had a very good relationship with them. But I'm really dismayed to see the people at Findhorn at this time supporting the thoroughly debunked theories of that carbon credits can somehow help with climate change, which has absolutely been disproven mathematically by Viscount Monckton. And so Lord Christopher Monckton, who's a wonderful soul, showed that the mathematics they were using to calculate global warming left out the sun. Oops. And so trying to come to some kind of consideration that the carbon dioxide, which serves as plant food, is somehow going to bring an end to civilization, when actually we know from satellite photographs it's made the earth more green. And so what I'd advise people, if that's your concern, go out and plant some trees. I planted personally myself 10 to 12,000 loblolly pines in Maryland with Steve Farmer from the Amboy Dukes. He's planted more than 1 million, but I planted 10 to 12,000, and now they're 90 feet tall. So I'm contributing to my personal use of carbons, and now those trees are giving forth wonderful oxygen for humans and animals to breathe. So if you feel like you have concerns about carbon dioxide, go out and plant a tree. By all means, plant them. I have trees all around my house here, and I think that that's a good thing. So, anyways, it's so easy for us to go far afield because our interests are so diverse. But I keep wanting to return to good old Lord Rosebery. Here is his 2-volume biography by Lord Crewe, and this Lord Rosebery, the Earl of Rosebery, he's Archibald Philip Primrose. He was the 5th Earl of Rosebery and the 1st Earl of Midlothian. And he was a British Liberal politician and who served as Prime Minister for a very short period of time. It was only from March 1894 to June of 1895. And what happened to him is interesting because he had some really interesting ideas regarding the British Empire. He was against socialism, mind you, which then what would be the alternative? Well, to be continued to be ruled by the landed gentry and the nobility, of course. A neo-feudalism was his view of things, although he approached it liberal. And it's too easy to throw the baby out with the bathwater and oversimplify these subjects. And so while you look at these people, you see that, well, they did come up with some good things. And ultimately, when you look at it, you have to be continually weighing things. But the backdrop behind this, and Rudolf Steiner makes the point, you have to consider the source. What is the source of their inspiration? To where are they getting their inspirations? Are they totally caught up in the materialistic impulses, or are they allowing the spiritual impulses that are represented by who we revere here on this podcast as that God is love, as it says in the Gospel of John. But then you have to say, well, what does that mean? Because that could be interpreted in a very strong way in terms of tough love. But I assure you that Henry Kissinger is not my idea of somebody carrying that impulse. And he is the individual that said that the 21st century is the century of China. Now, you mentioned the Silk Road project that China is attempting to put forth. The Chinese, just in their nature, are always continually attempting to expand. And but I've had friends that are Chinese. My next door neighbor in our previous residence was from China, and she was here with her son, and he was going to college here, then going back to China, which they did. And the people downstairs, her son married a girl from China, and he was majoring in computer studies and Mandarin Chinese. And so I've had quite a bit of exposure over the years to various people from China. And I have nothing against the Chinese people. It's their political system. And that's any system that's centralized, that attempts to present something as being altruistic. Keep in mind that they always tend to ignore the real topic at hand, which is human nature. That people aren't good enough to be able to end up with a good result from these great overarching systems. So, as David said on our last podcast, that empires always tend to be satanic. And that's what we're dealing with here is this whole material grip, and you see that freedom is gradually receding. although they already disarmed everybody in the UK. They haven't disarmed the United States, and I don't think they're going to pull it off, although they're really going to try. And we've really reached kind of an impasse here. God bless President Trump and the First Lady. I hope that they have a swift and speedy recovery, and it looks like that's what's in the offering. But that being said, it's kind of disturbing, or more than kind of disturbing, but very disturbing, the fact that there's some kind of magic bullet that the medical cartels can come up with that's going to save the planet. They're always trying to save the planet. It's gee, global warming didn't work. Now they're going to do it with their mandatory programs. No, I don't think so. At least I'm not signing on. Although at some point that may prevent me from being able to participate in commerce. But that's all described in the book of Revelations, isn't it? So we are living in apocalyptic times. And the reality is that it's not enough to live in a world determined entirely by economics.
Well, I remember that from our conversations on the pew. I hope we're not living in those times. I mean, on one level, there are always those times, I suppose. But I'm not ready. I'm not ready to meet our glorious Maker, not yet. I've so much to do, and the gospel needs to be shared, and we're not ready. We're not ready. What was it St. Augustine said? Save me, O Lord, but not yet, which I always thought was very sound advice indeed. Oh gosh, John, yeah, I never know what to say. I never know what to say about foreign countries unless I've been there a lot. I don't think it's the Chinese. I completely agree with you. It's not them as individuals. It's that system which needs to self-legitimate all the time. I get lots of correspondence, believe it or not, from Christians in that part of the world indirectly. I mean, I work primarily with Christians in Africa, primarily Kenya, Tanzania, but I don't and America, because of course I'm transferring, as I've said before, my credentials hopefully to Metropolitan Community Church, liberal Christianity, progressive Christianity, yada yada yada. But I do get to hear, because China is buying Africa. I do get to hear what is happening, so I know what the Chinese are doing in Central Asia, because I've chatted to them in Central Asia. I've not chatted to them in Africa, but I know what my African friends and colleagues are saying. And it's very clever. I mean, what they do is move into an area, and the first thing they do is inject lots of money, and they normally build some sort of medical facility and start dealing with training. They start training local untrained workers, and very, very soon everybody finds themselves doing basic classes in Mandarin. And I know what my African friends are saying, that this isn't on really. Either they're there to help or they're not. Well, of course they are and they're not. They're there to do trading. They're traders. But and I think the silence of the rest of the world, it's more fun in the media to have these sort of mock battles between politicians than actual look at the political realities as they're unfolding. This may come as a shock to lots of people. I was a great admirer of Chuck Missler, the American, rather right-wing evangelical. I thought he was a class act. I really did. No criticism whatsoever. I mean, he was a biblical scholar, a walking encyclopedia. I disagree with him profoundly on a number of internal Christian issues, and that's okay, because he's my brother in Christ. And I think he's wrong, and one day we'll all see who's right and who's wrong in that celestial kingdom of light. That's okay. But and you shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free, as it says in John. But it's less fun if international reporters are looking at what different countries are doing inside other countries, because it's not dramatic, it's not apocalyptic. I was shocked at certain sections of American the American press, I was going to be quite specific. I pulled back at the last minute. And certain factions of American society where they're basically wishing a death sentence on Donald Trump and the First Lady. I mean, yeah, if you disagree, disagree, but I don't see why that's acceptable. That shocked me a little, I must admit. You know, it's a human being who's got an illness, and we need to pray for him to get better, no matter what we think of what he's doing. That's a separate issue. But you know, there's too much of a gladiatorial display in all of this, whipped up by a completely insincere media, insincere and manipulative media that are provoking these gladiatorial battles all the time and turning a willful blind eye away from the way power is shifting. I mean, I hate to agree with anything Dr. Kissinger says. I was rebuked many years ago by someone, a very senior Christian colleague, who said, "You're too judgmental." What we say, because you can be judgmental without being judgmental, what we say is Christ is difficult to see in somebody. So I'll go down that route. Christ is very difficult to see in Dr. Kissinger, who has made a series of takeover bids in his career. But, you know, I hate to agree with him, but he's right. Power is shifting in that direction. I always thought on the pew Leo felt, you know, there was going to be some sort of restoration of the Cold War, which to my mind was fanciful and really looking for the type of certitude, you know, that certainties belonging to our recent past. There's a powerful block of commos here, and there's a powerful block of capitalists here, and you know, so everything's quite stable, everything's quite manageable. But I think history's moved on, and history is proving to be very insidious at the minute. It's being increasingly dictated to by Ahrimanic forces. Your analysis, as usual, is spot on. And materialism is arguably one of the central powers, if not the central power, of the present spirituality and mentation of China. You know, and it is shifting in that direction. And why is that scary? Not because the Chinese are all a group of swines that need a good biffing. You know, it's because look at their human rights record. Look at the way they treat their own people. Look at the cities that were felled by this virus that were effectively used as laboratories. This is absolutely unacceptable, let alone the fact it's very good over there to sell markets, you know, to sell on international markets the organs of convicted criminals. You know, the black market, you send someone to jail and have them executed, then you can harvest their organs and sell them on the black market, which is turning into a Chinese industry. You know, do we really want these things coming here? No. You know, so it's not about an incredible culture like China. It's not about the length of their history, and it's certainly not about the good hearts of their people. Their people have very good hearts. I agree with you 100%. It's about the system that insidiously worked its way to dominate that country, excuse me, and is determined to spread its wings everywhere else. Terrifying times, John. Terrifying. I'm handing it back to you because the cough's coming again.
Well, back in 1994, there was a book published by an investigative journalist, although they don't really have those anymore in any corporate entities. But there's a book, Thieves' World, The Threat of the New Global Network of Organized Crime. And this is a tremendous expose that showed the far reach of mafiosi in centralization and working with the cartels, and it's all tied in together in a shipping program that is they don't like to have ships travel empty, so a ship carrying human trafficking that can go exchange them for drugs, and it's about as dark as it can get. And then you get into the revelations of money laundering through HSBC, and and various other financial concerns that are tied into this network, even the Vatican Bank, so that is there a moral fiber behind any kind of global system at this point? And I've tried really hard to find one, and I have been unsuccessful in that regard. It's like the more centralized any system becomes, the darker its agenda becomes. And so consequently, it gets back to Rudolf Steiner was lecturing to, he talked about when he would lecture to groups of socialists, he said, I could talk about anything, really, I could talk about any subject, but save that of freedom. And so that's that whole bugaboo is that any of these centralized systems, they want to destroy freedom. Liberty is anathema to them. And so that's what I have trouble with. And so many glazed over liberals seem to think that, oh, but it's the good thing to do. And it's born out of sentimentality that doesn't understand the crux of the matter is the human condition, and that the consciousness of people is far too selfish at this stage of our evolution to be able to embrace any kind of far-reaching centralized system. That the worst elements of human nature would be enshrined in totalitarianism. And so no, I don't buy into any of that. And the system, the threefold system of US government is, as much as it has been derailed through the activities of all the lawyers that seem to occupy the posts in Washington and the bubble of the city-state of Washington, D.C. Inc. Nonetheless, we are in a struggle here. And really, if we don't pull it off, then I think it's really the end of the world as we know it, and that this whole globalist system will just engulf the world. Had Hillary Clinton won the presidency, there would be a North American Union, which would be like the EU, and there would be all manner of things going on in a neo-feudalist system that has been attempting to assert itself. But President Trump set aside certain, the various trade agreements which would have divested the citizens of the United States of their power for unilateral trade. And that's when you start getting into multilateral agreements and all of that, you see that this is all going back to the UN. I mean, that's really a creation that came out of Rockefeller's efforts, which is an extension of the efforts of the Milner Kindergarten, which is an extension of the Last Will and Testament of Cecil Rhodes. And if you remember, I've often made the point that the British Parliament made a decision to give money to Tsar Nicholas of Russia because of the struggle he was having with the Bolsheviks. So they agreed to give him the money. And they sent Lord Alfred Milner, Viscount Milner, to St. Petersburg to give them the money. Once he got there, he refused to give them the money. And within the next couple of weeks, the Tsar and his family were arrested and kept in house arrest for about a year, and then they were all shot. So if you're chasing centralized systems, you have to go back to very few places. City of London, which was really the nursery that developed Vladimir Lenin, Stalinism, Maoism, that came out of China, is largely an end result of the machinations of the British and U.S. intelligence. And, so it all roads lead to Rome, as they say. And it ties back to the network, the early network of intelligence that was developed by the Jesuits, working out of Rome and the Vatican, and that's a whole nother story that our friend Leo Lyons-Agami is so knowledgeable about that aspect of the challenge. And it's really a difficult subject to address because it's so far reaching. But at this point, what I think people have to do is keep in mind that what's happening here in the U.S. or in the colonies, as the Brits like to refer to it, is this next election in which we'll see what happens. Because in my mind, any society that has wholesale abortion going on is not a society that represents that God is love.
You're right, we cover huge ground in these conversations. Oh my heavens. What is truth? I like the traditional idea that truth is a person, because of course Steiner and Swedenborg both talk about personalism. So seeing truth as a person, or perhaps truth being as a person, is very important because it sheds light on what it means to be a human person. Without those metaphysical advantages, it sheds light on our condition, where we are and what we are. I posted something on Facebook a little earlier that I'm on the verge of giving David Icke an apology. Maybe even about these lizards. I mean, I was thinking about that the other day. I mean, if you look at Parliament at the moment, there are so many snakes, going around that building. Maybe I owe him a bigger apology than I actually thought. Oh, feudalism. I think if you grow up, if you mature, and most people don't, of course, in a European country where there have been traditional monarchies, it's a lot more challenging to note the good that the aristocracy have done, because it tends to be so minimal compared to the carnage and the sheer will to power, to quote Nietzsche, that goes along with all of that. Of course, I'm not doubting there are good members of the aristocracy as they're human beings. And I'm not doubting there have been families that have more than adequately proved their worth as national and international treasures, being benefactors to the arts, being benefactors to the humanities. Not denying it, but I think if we're talking about overarching systems, we also need to drag feudalism into this. I mean, to my mind, and again, I agree with you, what's really being tried here is the reassertion of the feudal model. And, it's just not attractive. If you're a Brit, you know what it means. Yes, my lord. No, my lord. I'll do anything you want, my lord, because you'll have the bailiffs turn up and throw me out of my house if I don't agree. There's nothing glorious. I mean, W.B. Yeats, the great Nobel Prize-winning poet. I don't know why they keep coming up today, but they do. Was, of course, also one of the founders, if not the principal founder, I can't quite recall offhand, of the Irish Fascist Party. Of course, the word fascism also means different things in different places, and it got tied in with Irish nationalism. We mustn't forget that. And he painted somewhere, I can't remember the literary piece offhand. I will do some digging and come up with it for next week. This wonderful model where you have people, the noble houses listening to petitioners and then going off to this great assembly where all of their sort of local interests and needs were discussed in this lofty manner. My God, if only that was true. I mean, didn't Yeats know anything about history? That's exactly what didn't happen. The noble houses would disagree and a war would start. There we are. That's what happened. And anyone that thinks politics is to do with great brains rationally arguing out the verities needs to spend a day in the British Parliament. That will be destroyed in the first hour. These are career people who want a glorious job with lots of perks. One or two of them, yeah, they are there. One or two of them are great, but that's one or two of them, not the House. Yeah, we've got to start looking at what we're dealing with here. Sadly, I agree with you, John. I mean, I'm so grateful to have met you through the pew. You've become a friend of mine, and this show I think is doing parallel work to the pew. I mean, we're going in greater depth into some of the issues we only could touch upon in the pew, and that's why I think this show is so exciting. But well, maybe, and we can't, we can never escape a political element, which is also interesting. Um, Either we believe in liberty or we don't. Traditional politics doesn't believe in liberty, period. And therefore, we've got to start thinking, where does that place us? And what does that mean in the reality that we find ourselves in, the economic reality, the cultural reality, the political reality? The reality is that the upper classes, which are still very visible in Britain, want their power back. And certainly the coronavirus, the COVID-19 crisis, I mean, I'm not one of the people who thinks nothing is going on. Yeah, I think there's a medical issue here. Whether it's a global pandemic, well, of course, that depends what you mean. And I notice various operatives in the WHO also disagree. They seem to disagree amongst themselves about what's going on, and that's hardly ever reported. Um, it's leading to censorship. I mean, a very eminent British doctor has now finding himself having his license stripped away, and he's no longer encouraged to publish after 80 books because he's now saying he's worried about certain types of vaccination, and of course the vaccines can be polluted. My God, what a rebel! I'd have thought that was common sense, and now he finds himself on the receiving end of an increasingly hierarchical establishment. We've got to think, where is it going and why? And I, for one, don't want to see a neo-feudalism, for the simple reason I know enough about medieval history to remember what happened. And it is not a pretty story. I'll hand back to you, John, while I have another sip of water. Reverend David's throat is playing up today.
Yeah, so there you have it. I mean, it's again the rule of scientism, which is not to say that that means science. Scientism is taking certain aspects of science and turning it into a belief system that possesses powers. And so now we're going through an assertion coming out of the medical community that is endeavoring to assert control over a human population, which, if you study these things, it's not surprising at all, because the Imperial Press Conference of 1909 that I made reference to, and the keynote speaker being Lord Rosebery, if you look into that, you see that it was financed by Burroughs Wellcome, which was one of the leading pharmaceutical chemical companies in Britain at the time, and they were the ones that were responsible for the experiments, the medical experimentation on the populace down in South Africa during the Second Boer War, when they established the concentration camps upon which the Nazi concentration camps of World War II were based. So that this whole Rhodesian model of authority and authoritarianism is what we're looking at here. And when you get into understanding that it's not anything new, that there's this assertion of intelligence within the media. So now news is no longer news, but propaganda. And it's no surprise that the assertion of authority is coming through the medical establishment, because really the intelligence community was established by those very financial resources. And so it's just a nexus of power that it's new to people coming to the realization that it exists. But you have people, fortunately, you have like Dr. Judy Mikovits, who she goes and explores her experience, one scientist's intrepid search for the truth about human retrovirus and chronic fatigue syndrome, autism and other diseases, the complications of vaccination programs, and her book, Plague of Corruption, Restoring Faith in the Promise of Science, with a foreword by John Kennedy Jr. And so, you know, there's people out there that are trying to get the word out, and I hope we don't get in trouble for bringing up the subject, because these things are allowed but not permitted. And so that's the world in which we live. But keep in mind that any neo-feudalist system, the great failing of the feudalist system, and mind you, the Republic of Plato is based upon a dictatorship, a benevolent dictator. Okay, when you get into blood, these descending hierarchies of the nobility, well, that's all well and good if you got somebody benevolent. But what if his son is not benevolent? All you got to do is go back and think about Nero. He was a real charmer. Or Caligula. And so if you have ancestral power, you always have the challenge of the next one in line not being benevolent. And the American system is a system of checks and balances meant to prevent the abnormal acquisition of power. And so that's where we're at right now, and we have an opportunity to save it.
Well, I hope there isn't a civil war in America. Everybody keeps telling me it's a possibility. I really hope that doesn't happen. America still represents an incredible ideal and a promise to the whole planet. I mean, that mustn't happen. In that glorious country, yes, it has flaws, but hey, that's human too. Yeah, exactly. We need to hold on to ideas and free communication and free speech. I hope I haven't got us off the air by mentioning the forbidden subject. I mean, yeah, my view is if it can be upheld, and I know you've got evidence, if it can be upheld that the present crisis is man-made, in other words, it's an act of bioengineering, then there need to be trials and arrests. You know, not pretending nothing is happening. I don't know where I go with all of that. Certainly in terms of, you know, and it's a mistake to think, I mean, even the divine Plato, I mean, who can argue with Plato? You know, he's not right about everything. Just because he's got one of the most incredible brains in history, doesn't mean he's right about everything. He's a human being too. What helps us expand and grow is liberal democracy, not hierarchy. You know, that was a thing for then. But it would take an awful lot for me to be convinced it's a thing for now, because I simply don't believe in it. You've already hit, you know, that particular animal on the head. What if the son or the grandson is a complete stinker? What happens then? Then the whole thing falls apart and you're back to square one. I have tried over the last 10 years or so to separate tradition from hierarchy. It's got me into a certain amount of trouble in this neck of the woods, but I still think that's worth doing. You know, so what's the great tradition of the British people? The British people. You know, I mean, if you look at the diggers, you look at the levelers, you look at all of the hundreds of years where progress was embraced here. What gave the British Health Service to the British? Now, it has lots of problems, the British Health Service. I was one of the people out every Thursday night clapping the NHS during the recent problems. Everyone used to go to their windows in the streets. People would stand and they would clap because these people were working their asses off. They were working until they dropped to deal with a crisis, and they were good, beautiful, lovely people. But we're talking about doctors and nurses, of course, not the machinery of the system that they're in. The machinery of the system, the NHS as it's become, is now openly an unrecognised and unofficial political powerhouse. You know, it's got its own agenda that isn't really indicative of retaining respect. You know, it will lose power, authority, and respect, and then the whole enterprise will be thrown into disrepute if we're not careful. I rather like the idea of a health service that you can enter without any thought of money at the beginning. I think that's a very, very good idea, because as an old liberal Brit, it worries me when that's not there. But we've also got to face the realities. Certainly the British Health Service, the NHS, and Transport for London, TfL, they are political agencies now, and they've got their own agendas, and they're trying to argue and play politics instead of do their job and instead of stick to their purpose. We've got to be very, very careful of what's happening. Why did the British get an NHS? It was actually a liberal idea. I mean, it was a socialist government that brought it into play, but it was actually a liberal idea. What do British socialists do? They take good liberal ideas, they boil them down, and they steal them. That's what British socialists do. And I'm shaking my fist at them. That was a bloody good idea. Why did it happen? Because all these young men came back from World War II, and they knew how to fight, and they all had weapons. That's why we got a British health service. It wasn't the beauty of the conscience of the upper classes, and that's why now it's being withdrawn slowly through internal markets and increasing abuse, where it's become a political institution. I'll hand back to you before I go as red as a lobster with anger, which is my want when it comes to things like this, because we're just about to lose some national treasures if we're not careful.
Well, yeah, if you want to get into the British Health Service, that leads back to here's a book here, Rearing an Imperial Race, the National Food Reform Association. This also has reference to Lord Rosebery, and there were some good things that came out of it. The first school luncheon program and having a balanced diet, all that was put forward here. But there's also certain principles of eugenics that are so much tied into rearing an imperial race. So there's always seems to be a fly in the ointment, and when you give any centralized association any kind of potent powers, that's what you end up with, because that's human nature. And so I don't pretend to be able to solve the riddle of British culture at this time. I think it's critical at this time, by whatever means they might try to reharmonize what's going on there, because they seem to be eaten whole, so to speak, and likewise down under, and all members. There was a big in Quebec in Canada. There was this big demonstration just last week of thousands of Canadians in support of President Trump. It's like, and this guy phoned into Alex's show, and he said, geez, after he gets done being president, he could probably come to Canada and win the election. So there's a lot of people that think that there's something human about liberty, that freedom is really the issue. And the Christ impulse is such that it doesn't impel you. It doesn't wish to compel you. What I see is the God is love idea of the Christ impulse, and that for someone to come to the Christ impulse as a free decision, as a free human being, that is the most noble gesture. And ultimately, that's what I look for in my inspirations. Now we're getting near the end of our show here, and so I want to remind people that you can find books by Reverend David. They're available on Amazon, and my books are available on eBay, The Arcana of Light on the Path and The Arcana of the Grail Angel. And if you want to buy us a cup of coffee or something like that, donate towards our endeavor. You could donate to me through paypal.me/John Barnwell 888. You can donate to Reverend David at paypal.me/DPARRY 777. And if you want to get further information to deepen your studies, you can go to American Intelligence Media and aimfortruth.org or Americans for Innovation. And the 4 in both of those is a number. So it's aimfortruth.org and americansforinnovation.blogspot.com. And to access a deepening of your familiarity with the work of Rudolf Steiner, you can go to the Rudolf Steiner Archive. And please consider donating to support their noble endeavor. And David, I want to thank you so much for being my friend, first of all. And if you could, lead us in a prayer to try and help us see through this dark night of the soul.
Well, I need to thank you for being my friend as well. I mean, one of the true blessings that came from the pew. Just a quick anecdote before I get to my prayer. I was one of the people, 1 million people marched through London against the Iraq war. I was actually stood next to a friend of mine, the Bishop of London, dressed in his full regalia. And when the press said to Tony Blair, what's your reaction to this huge march passing through London? He said, what march? Yeah, I mean, you can't miss 1 million people, and you certainly couldn't miss the Bishop of London in his full regalia with this gigantic golden cross. So anyway, that's politics. My dear friends, my dear friend John, dear viewers and listeners, there's always light at the end of the darkness, and the darkness always leads to the dawn. We are the hands and the eyes of the Spirit, and the truth will always set us free, no matter how long and how hard we have to labor in order to attain it. God bless you all and keep the faith at this most challenging of times. Amen.
Amen, brother. Thank you so much. I'll see you next week.